because we are in Greece, and Greek has a huge, important tradition, the origin of sports, the origin of theater. We thought it's appropriate to invite people that focus or they display this aspect of Greece. So I heard about a very good recommendation about the group of George Kollias, who studied in Oxford for the master thesis, if I remember well, from our Zoom talk. And they are expert in the classical tragedy and other aspects of the Greek tradition here. So maybe you will introduce more about where you come from, but I thought it's an occasion to go into Plato, Aristo, and others. So please, Kollias.
Dear friends, kalispera, χαίρετε, the ancient Greeks would say. First of all, I'd like to say it's a great honor and a privilege and a pleasure to be presenting to you, so thank you very much for the invitation. Today, I'm going to speak about one of my favorite topics, so I don't want to bore you with introductory remarks. I'm George Kollias. I study and I do presentations on ancient Greece in its different facets: history, philosophy, archaeology, art. I believe that ancient Greece is always relevant, is always contemporary, and it helps us understand our world better. I think that by understanding Greece, we understand who we are in a better way. Just as a quick introduction, today's presentation is hybrid, which means that you'll have my narration with a combination, an interplay of original readings from the Greek texts in an English translation by me. Don't worry, we won't bore you with ancient Greek. So I'd like to introduce my two colleagues today. I'm very happy to have two very good friends, actually a father and a daughter duo. Hariton Marenikolakis and Myrto Marenikolaki, who will be doing the readings for us. Duration approximately 1 hour. At the end, we'll have a Q&A session. So if you don't mind, let's leave all the questions and the comments at the end. I'm sure we'll have a very lively discussion. Okay, so if you're ready, about to start. I'll try to sit in the middle because we're videotaping it, but I always have a tendency to move around, so excuse me. Okay, today I'm going to talk about a book that was written around 390 BCE, Plato's Apology of Socrates. And this brings me to a joke from my high school days. The teacher says, how do we know that Socrates was a real person rather than the ideological construct of his time? And the pupil raises his hand, sir, his picture is in our textbooks. Now, this is spot on, I find, because there isn't, and there never has been, a single sentence written by this Socrates. He never wrote anything. However, there are 30-odd books written by Plato, most of which are Socratic dialogues, and in which a character named Socrates discusses philosophy with other eminent men of the age. Apart from Plato, there are hundreds of references to Socrates in ancient and Byzantine writers, starting with a historian called Xenophon, who also wrote Socratic works and may have been a student of Socrates. So it would be very unlikely today to meet anyone who will tell you that Socrates was simply a fictional hero created by Plato, someone like Harry Potter, Alyosha Karamazov, or Anna Karenina. However, the sources outside Plato mostly give us anecdotes and questionable biographical data. It is indisputable that our main source for Socrates' thought is Plato. And it is also indisputable that Socrates could not possibly have made all the complex arguments that Plato puts in his mouth in the dialogues. For example, it is inconceivable, at least to me, that this loafer, this flaneur, would have designed the Republic, this intricate system of the Republic. Yes, someone may counter. But Plato's Apology, the book we are talking about today, is different. It is an exception. Here, we do not have a philosophical dialogue. Here we have the text of the speech that Socrates gave in the trial that led to his conviction and his execution. And therefore, Plato was obliged to record the master's words faithfully. Now, even if we accept, for the sake of argument, that Plato starts his career as a writer with a documentary account of this trial, the trial of Socrates, I would like us to take a look at what another Athenian writer, a man who was obsessed with historical accuracy, has to say on the subject of recording speeches. So Thucydides, the great historian, was about 10 years younger than Socrates. In the beginning of his history of the Peloponnesian War, he does us the favor of spelling out exactly the methodology he used in transcribing the orations of his protagonists. So let us read some Thucydides.
As for the speeches, both before the war and during it, it was difficult for me to remember precisely what was said, both for those that I heard myself and for those that were reported to me by others. So, I write what it seemed to me that the circumstances demanded, while staying as close as possible to the general idea of what was truly said.
So we should consider that Plato wrote the Apology about a decade after the execution of Socrates, an event that, of course, was a shock and a turning point in the life of the student. Presumably, Plato did not have access to notes. I find it hard to believe that anybody took a notebook to Socrates' trial. And he had to strike a balance, exactly as Thucydides pointed out, between what the circumstances demanded that Socrates should say and what he actually did say. In fact, bearing in mind also that the speech which Socrates used, whatever it might have been, was not successful. He did not convince his judges to acquit him, and also that Plato was very well aware of the fact that this text of his, in the end, would determine the teacher's legacy, how posterity would remember him. Now, before we start looking at what this Apology of Socrates actually says, I would like us to understand a little how Socrates ended up having to make a closing argument in a trial for his life. The year is 399 BCE. 5 years before, in 404 BCE, Athens suffered a humiliating defeat in the Peloponnesian War. And the sources tell us that the winners, the Spartans and their allies, came close to obliterating the city, to turn it into grazing land for sheep. And furthermore, for a few months at the end of the war, the famous Athenian democracy was overthrown by an extremely brutal regime, the 30 tyrants, with extreme exiles and executions and assassinations. So therefore, this is a time, when the trial happens, when the restored democracy is trying to pull itself together again. 403 BC practically becomes year zero in the Athenian legal system. There's an amnesty for all older cases, and so therefore you can no longer prosecute anyone for an offense committed before 403 or for an offense that is not included in the list of the laws of the city as they have just been collected again. So in this climate, 3 Athenian citizens, Melitus, Anytus, and Lycon, filed a written indictment against Socrates with the Archon Vasilevs, the king magistrate, for impiety. Now, the title sounds very pompous, king magistrate, but like most officers in democratic Athens, the king magistrate had no special education, expertise, or family pedigree whatsoever. He was elected by lot annually. Simply, the office had inherited a lot of the traditional responsibilities of the kings of Athens, including the jurisdiction for religious crimes, such as the crime that Socrates was accused of. We have the full text of the indictment, and it read, Socrates does wrong because he does not believe in the gods that the city believes in, but he introduces new demons and he corrupts the young. After the king magistrate received the indictment, he proceeded with an anakrisis, a formal examination, and after satisfying himself that the accusation was not completely unfounded, he proceeded to take the matter to court. An example of a completely unfounded accusation that has survived in Athenian legal history was when someone accused the neighbor of murder, and then the alleged murderer appeared before the king magistrate along with his alleged victim, who was alive unwell. We cannot be sure whether this trial that we are describing happened in the traditional court of Athens, the Heliaea, and we do not know the exact number of the judges. There were certainly several hundred of them, perhaps 500, according to the tradition. In order to avoid bribery, the judges themselves were selected by lot on the same morning of the trial. And ever since the days of Pericles, the great politician, the judges received a daily stipend, but the amount was lower than the wages of a manual laborer. Therefore, we have to consider that most of the judges came from the lower social classes. They were elderly, handicapped, unskilled, no legal training whatsoever. And in fact, Aristophanes, the comedian, he has given us a very colorful account of how the judges worked in a comedy called The Wasps. The whole trial had to be completed within a single day. The accuser spoke first. We do not have their speeches, and we do not know what evidence or what witnesses they introduced, and Socrates spoke after them. Now, both sides in a trial in Athens had to appear in person in court, no attorneys. However, you could buy a ready-made speech from one of the professional speechwriters in the city. And there's a story that the big name among the speech makers, an orator called Lysias, gave a speech to Socrates, but Socrates declined to use it. He said that such a beautiful oration would be out of character as if you were to appear neat and smartly dressed in court. Therefore, Plato's Apology of Socrates is the text where Plato supposedly gives us the words that Socrates said in his trial. Let us read the first passage.
So, it is fair, Athenian men, that I first give an account of the first false accusations against me and the first accusers, and then of the later ones. You see, for a long time, many accusers have come to you, saying nothing that is true. And I am afraid of these older accusers more than I am afraid of Anytus and his group, although they are terrible as well. But they are even more terrible those who got hold of most of you while you were still children, and convinced you and falsely accused me, saying that there is a wise man called Socrates, who explores the heavenly bodies and investigates everything underground and makes the weaker argument stronger. They who have spread these rumors, Athenian men, are my terrible accusers. For anyone who hears this thinks that the people who inquire into these things do not believe in the gods either. After all, these accusers are numerous, and they have already been accusing me for many years, starting at an age where you were more likely to believe them, as many of you were children or adolescents. And they simply accuse me in my absence, with no one to speak up for me. And the most absurd thing is that I don't even know to tell you their names, unless it is some comedy writer. So let us examine from the beginning what was the accusation that started the slanders against me, on which Meletus, who believed them himself, based his indictment. So what did my slanderers claim? I have to read you their statements as if they were formal prosecutors. Socrates does wrong. He explores and investigates heavenly and underground matters. He makes the weaker argument stronger, and he teaches all this to others. Such is the accusation. And you have seen this in Aristophanes' comedy, a certain Socrates wandering on air and blabbering incessantly on things that I know nothing about, neither big nor small. And I say this not in order to demean this body of knowledge, if someone has it, nor in order to escape Meletus' attacks, but simply because I, Athenian men, have nothing to do with these things. Here, I call as my witness most of you, and I ask you to speak among yourselves and to instruct each other, those of you that have ever heard my discussions, and many of you have. If you have ever heard me say anything, big or small, about these things, and thus you will understand that such are all the other things that the many say about me. But none of it is true. And if anyone has told you that I try to educate people and receive money for this, this is not true either. Although it seems to me that this is good as well. If someone can educate people, such as Gorgias of Leontini, and Prodigus of Chios, and Hippias of Elis. Because each one of them, Athenian men, can go from town to town and convince the young, who are able to speak with any of their fellow citizens for free, to abandon their acquaintances and spend time with them, giving them money and thinking that they owe them a favor as well.
For a very long time, Socrates says, they have been trying to convince you that I'm a dangerous crank, that I'm an Anaxagoras or Protagoras, to use our modern jargon, a natural philosopher and a sophist. And indeed, in Aristophanes' comedy, The Clouds, an Athenian father called Strepsiades sends his son to the Frontisterion, the thinking shop, the school of an eccentric teacher, Socrates, who gets paid to teach his students the natural sciences and how to make the unjust argument defeat the just. And at the end of the play, an enraged Strepsiades burns the thinking shop. Now, Socrates takes it for granted that everyone appreciates that there's an abyss separating him from all other teachers. However, here, I find that a concept by Sigmund Freud is very relevant, the narcissism of small differences. This basically says that two people may think that they're completely different, and they may be mortal enemies because, say, the one supports Manchester United and the other supports Manchester City. However, it is extremely probable that most outside observers cannot even tell them apart. And here, feel free to take any pair you wish. Sigmund Freud versus Carl Jung, Tolstoy versus Dostoevsky, Oxford versus Cambridge. And in fact, it was exactly this confusion that Aristophanes exploited in order to write his satire and to put the label Socrates on this amalgam, this pastiche he created of all the thinkers, poets, philosophers, teachers, sophists who were making the rounds in Athens. Okay, then, let us accept that the Athenians confused Socrates with the other representatives of 5th century Enlightenment, that they mistook him for an Anaxagoras or Protagoras. Was this a reason to kill him? Was it dangerous to be an intellectual in classical Athens? Opinions on this point are divided. We do have reports of persecutions, but for many of them we suspect that they may be the fabrications of later-day historians on the blueprint of the trial of Socrates. Apart from Anaxagoras and Protagoras, some of the names of thinkers who supposedly got into trouble with the law in Athens were Aspasia of Miletos, the consort of Pericles, Euripides, the tragedian, and Diagoras of Milos. What we would really like to understand here is how the concept of orthodoxy functioned in Athens. The Athenians did not use the term orthodoxy in our sense. And what could constitute a transgression against this orthodoxy?
What is this term? I don't know the term.
Sorry?
What did you say?
Orthodoxy.
What is it?
Oh, sorry. It means the correct belief. Here, for example, we to have to be orthodox.
Orthodoxy.
Orthodoxy pronounced. Okay. Orthodoxy. Okay. What could constitute a transgression against it, no matter how pronounced? Was it criminal to speculate about the structure, the substance, and the origin of the universe? Was it criminal to doubt the myths in Homer, all these quaint, naughty stories about the gods? And did comedy writers have some special form of legal immunity in Athens? And I ask this because Aristophanes, the comedian himself, 5 or 6 years before Socrates' trial, had presented the god Dionysus on stage, receiving a spanking on his bottom. However, and this is extremely important here, before Socrates, no intellectual had been executed in Athens for his philosophical theories. You can be quite certain about that. Therefore, here, there are two alternatives. The first alternative is that this trial wasn't just about what Socrates said, but also what he did. Perhaps there was also a major sacrilege involved here, which escapes us, and which Plato prefers to keep silent about. Or maybe Socrates was simply the victim of the anti-intellectual fervor that swept Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War, as often happens in history in times of distraction and upheaval. The other wise men ran away or lay low. Most of them were non-Athenians anyway, foreigners, which left Socrates alone, the only Athenian and the only one who continued his public philosophical inquiries unperturbed to receive the full force of popular rage. Let us continue.
Perhaps one of you might ask me, Socrates, what is your subject? What is it that you do? How did these slanders against you arise? For you wouldn't have made such a name for yourself if you didn't concern yourself with matters that are of little interest to others, or if you didn't act differently from other people. So tell us what this is all about, so that we don't have to speculate about you. So listen, and it may seem to some of you that I'm joking, but know that I shall be telling the whole truth. And, Athenian men, keep quiet if it seems to you that I'm saying anything extravagant, because I won't be giving you my own words. I will be reporting the words of someone very credible. So for my witness, I will be presenting Apollo, the god of Delphi. You all knew Hierophon, of course, who was a childhood friend of mine, and you remember what he was like. Once, when he went to Delphi, he dared to ask the following question, and keep quiet for what I'm about to say, man. So he asked if anyone was wiser than Socrates. And the priestess Pythia answered that no one was wiser. And all this can be confirmed by his brother, because Hierophon himself is dead. Now, pay attention in order to understand why I'm telling you all this, because I am about to show you how the slanders against me were born. When I heard this, I pondered as follows. What is the god saying? And what is he insinuating? I know that I'm not wise, neither a lot nor a little. So why could he be saying that I am the wisest of all? He cannot be lying, of course. It is not appropriate for a god. And for a long time, I was wondering what he meant, until, at last, I began to investigate the subject in the following manner. I went to one of the men who considered wise in order to challenge the oracle and to answer it. This one here is wiser than me, and then you say that I am wiser. So while examining him, there is no need to mention his name, he was one of the politicians, and talking to him, this is what happened to me. It occurred to me that this man seemed to be wise to other people, and above all to himself, but he was not. After him, I continued to visit others. while I suspected and sensed and regretted and feared that I was becoming unpopular, but it seemed to me necessary to examine the oracle. And by the dog, Athenian man, for I have to tell you the truth, this is what happened. The men who had the greatest reputation seemed to me to be almost the most ignorant when I examined them according to the divine command, whereas others with a more humble reputation were more sensible. So after the politicians, I went to the poets, both the composers of tragedies and of dithyrambs, in order to catch myself in the very act of being more ignorant than them. And in the end, I went to the artisans, because I knew that while I knew nothing, I would find them knowing a lot of good things. And in this, I wasn't proved wrong, because they knew what I did not know, and in this, they were wiser than me. However, Athenian man, it seemed to me that the artisans suffered from the same error as the poets. Each of them, because he was an expert in his own art, he thought that he was the wisest in all other things. And this offense obscured the wisdom that they indeed possessed. So I began to wonder, finally appreciating the words of the oracle. If I would prefer to be as I am, neither wise with their wisdom, nor ignorant with their ignorance, or to be like them. And I replied, both to myself and the oracle, that it is better for me to be as I am. And from this habit of mine, Athenian man, there arose many enmities against me, very grave and very dangerous. And from these enmities, many slanders arose, and I acquired the name of being wise. For every time I examine someone, those present believe that I am wise on the topics on which I examine him. But it seems, men, that only God is wise. And the oracle says exactly this, that human wisdom is only of little value, perhaps even none. And it seems that my name is used as an example, as if to say, the wisest among you humans is he who, like Socrates, knows that he is in fact completely worthless in respect to wisdom. On top of this, the young men who follow me of their own accord, and mostly those who have lots of free time, the richer ones, are pleased when they hear me examining people, and often they imitate me and attempt to examine others themselves. And I believe they find an abundance of people who think they know something but know very little or nothing. Then those who are examined get angry at me, not them, and they say that there is a certain despicable Socrates who corrupts the young. And when people ask them what I do and what I teach, although they do not know and have nothing to say, in order to prevent their ignorance from coming to light, they repeat the stock accusations against those who philosophize about the heavens and the underground, and he doesn't believe in the gods, and he makes the weaker argument appear stronger, because I think that they don't want to admit the truth that is revealed, namely that while they'll pretend to know, they know nothing.
It is a very interesting question whether this is a sound defense strategy. You are accused of a capital crime, and you stand up in court and say, let me explain to you why the whole city hates me. And I think, furthermore, we have every reason to doubt that Socrates himself would have presented such an elaborate account of his work and his modus operandi in court, or whether Plato here simply sees the opportunity to present the teacher in action for posterity. In either case, we modern readers are extremely grateful. We have just been given a first-class picture of Socrates' daily practice. Because Socrates, after all, is famous not for any specific philosophical theories, but for this tendency to keep asking questions. My mother was a midwife, he says in the Theaetetus, another dialogue by Plato, and so, like her, I do not give birth to my own ideas, I help others deliver theirs. I must say that every time that I read this passage, and especially his point about the artisans, I cannot help but imagine one of the anonymous sculptors who decorated the Erechtheion. I'm not sure if you had a chance to go to the Acropolis yet. The Erechtheion is the smaller temple opposite the Parthenon. And speaking of the Parthenon, by the way, there's a tradition that says that Socrates' father was a stonemason. And as the trades and the professions in Athens were mostly hereditary, it is not impossible that a young Socrates himself may have worked in the construction of the Parthenon. But let us go back to this anonymous sculptor. You are one of the most famous artists in Athens. You spend your whole day in Acropolis carving the caryatids, the girls, the chora, the columns, in the southern facade of the Erechtheion. And if you want, let's become more specific. You are carving the second caryatid from the left, the one that Greece is now trying to get back from the British Museum. And then, someday after work, you go down to the Agora, the marketplace, to grab a bite to eat or a drink of wine. And it is then that Socrates approaches you with his customary irony. Oh, you splendid man, how fortunate to bump into you. I must come up one of these days and admire your work on this new temple. But please tell me, you are the expert, what is beauty? To kalos, the Greeks would say. So you, the sculptor, give a first definition of beauty. Socrates asks you some follow-up questions. You get confused, you fall into contradictions. Socrates keeps pushing you, and the discussion ends in the conclusion that the creator of the caryatid has no idea what beauty really is. And perhaps even worse, behind Socrates, there's a bunch of super fit, arrogant, aristocratic youths having a blast, witnessing Socrates expose your complete ignorance. Annoying? Definitely annoying. But is it enough to get anyone executed? Okay, let's see what else Socrates has to say about his mission in the city.
And for as long as I breathe and I have the strength, I will not stop philosophizing and exhorting and pointing out things to any one of you that I happen to come across, telling him exactly what is my custom to say. My good man, you are an Athenian, a citizen of the greatest city and the most flourishing in wisdom and power. Are you not ashamed to concern yourself with how to acquire more money and glory and honor, and not to care or worry about good sense and truth and how to improve your soul? And if someone challenges me and answer that he does care, I will not let him get away, but I will ask him questions and examine him and test him. And if it seems to me that he does not possess virtue, but only appears to possess it, I will put him to shame for doing so little for the things that matter and so much for the things of no value. And this I will do to anyone that I happen to meet. For this the God commands me, know it well. And I think that there has never been a greater benefit to the city than my service to the God. For I do nothing but go around and convince you, the young and the old alike, not to concern yourselves with your bodies or with money, but first of all, and most passionately, with your souls, and how to make them as good as possible, saying that virtue does not come from money, but that virtue is necessary for money and for all other good, both private and public. If I corrupt the young by saying these things, then yes, they are harmful. And if anyone tells you that I say something different and not this, then that person is lying. And for this, Athenian men, either believe Anytus or do not believe him, and either release me or do not release me. But I do not intend to start doing other things, even if I were to die many times. Now, Athenian men, I am not pleading on my own behalf, as one might suppose, but for your sake, to prevent you from erring against that which God gave to you, by condemning me. For if you kill me, it will not be easy to find another one, to put it simply and humorously, who has been sent by the god to the city, which resembles a great thoroughbred horse, which has grown lazy and which needs a gadfly to wake it up. It seems to me that this is why the god has placed me among you, to wake you up and to convince you and to castigate you all day long, without pause, making the rounds everywhere. Another one like me will not appear easily to you, men, and if you believe me, you will have to spare me. But perhaps you will get bored, like those who wake up drowsy and having been convinced by Anytus, you will easily crush me. Then you will spend the rest of your lives asleep, unless God takes care of you and sends you somebody else in my place.
The first concern for any man should be the care for his soul. Now, it seems to me that these words sound less bizarre to us than they would have sounded to the original audience of 399. And this is because, to a very large extent, we live in a world that has been shaped by Platonic philosophy. First of all, there's this binary model. Body and soul as two distinct entities, with the soul being the more precious of the two. If you were to tell a Homer or a Sophocles that a man should care for and cultivate his soul first, and then his body, it is unclear whether they would even understand what you were trying to say, let alone that they would agree with you. However, perhaps more importantly, here we have a tremendous shift in emphasis from the public to the private sphere, or if you prefer, from the city to the individual. And in order to explain this, I would like us to read a short passage from Pericles' epitaph, the speech for the fallen dead of the first year of the Peloponnesian War, as recorded by Thucydides.
We take care of our private affairs, as well as of the affairs of the city. And although we have other business, we are not ignorant of political issues. For we alone consider the man who abstains from politics not easygoing and peace-loving, but useless.
5th century Athens was neither a totalitarian collective like Sparta, nor an oriental autocracy like Persia. We attend to our own private business, Pericles says. However, the city was always the first priority, its salvation and its glory. You were an Athenian citizen before anything else. Apart from and outside your city, you had no identity. And Socrates comes here and says that the care of the soul is above all. And a bit further down in the Apology, he will argue that to be a private citizen, the very trait which makes you useless, according to Pericles, is actually necessary if you're going to fight for justice. And here I would like us to note that the Greek word for a private individual was idiotis, and etymologically, that's where the English word idiot comes from. The private individual was the idiot. But Socrates was a child of his age. He spent his whole life in public, discussing philosophy in the agora. And he himself will tell the court that whenever he was called to fight in the battles of the Athenian army, he performed his duties diligently. Socrates was no Hamlet, a melancholic intellectual philosophizing alone in the privacy of his study, and he was no pacifist agitator. However, we should repeat this. Here we have a seismic breach in the relations between the city and the individual. Socrates tells us that we should stop considering ourselves primarily as citizens, as members of a polis, but as autonomous moral decision-making agents with a responsibility to keep searching, to keep examining, to keep looking for the truth, and to act accordingly. Now, there is a passage in the Apology that is very easy to miss and to overlook on a first reading, but for many it holds the key to this whole affair, so I would please like us to read it now.
Such has always been my conduct in life, public or private. I have never yielded an inch wherever justice was concerned, not to anyone, not to those who slander against me by claiming to be my students. I have never been anyone's teacher. And if anyone wants to hear me when I talk and when I do my thing, either young or old, I have never sent him away. Nor do I only talk with people who pay me and refuse if they don't. But rather, I offer myself equally to anyone, rich or poor, who wants to ask me something or hear my answers to questions. And if any of them ends up being a good man or not, it is not my responsibility, for I never promised anything to anyone, nor taught a lesson. And if anyone says that he heard or learned something from me privately, apart from everyone else, you should know it well, that he is not telling the truth. But then, why do so many enjoy spending time with me? You have already heard it, Athenian man, and I have told you the whole truth. They enjoy hearing me examine those who believe that they are wise, but who are not.
These remarks are obviously consistent with what Socrates told us before, that is, that he himself possesses no wisdom except for an awareness of human ignorance, and therefore he could never be anyone's teacher. However, many here think that we can discern between the lines the elephant in the room, the true unspoken accusation against Socrates. And this line of interpretation has an ancient pedigree. Some 50 years after the trial, in the 4th century, an orator called Aeschines, in a speech on a completely unrelated matter, made the following striking remark: "And you Athenians killed Socrates the sophist because he seemed to have been the teacher of Kollias, one of the 30. Now, Socrates himself before admitted that many of the young rich men of Athens followed him. And it is true that as the years went by, quite a few members of this gang of Socrates' disciples ended up playing sinister roles in the affairs of the city. First and foremost, Alcibiades, Socrates' closest companion, who changed sides many times in the Peloponnesian War and defected to the enemies of Athens, the Persians and the Spartans, and then Plato's two uncles, Kollias and Charmides, who were prime movers in the regime of the 30 tyrants. After the war, the Athenians decided in favor of a policy of mimnisi kakin, as they called it. Let us not remember the old injuries, and granted a general amnesty for the period of the 30 tyrants. So here there are two possibilities. One is that there existed a democratic faction inside the city who did not believe in forgetting the old injuries, who wanted to take revenge against Socrates for this collaboration with the 30 tyrants, but because of the general amnesty, they had to resort to the pretense of a religious trial. Or alternatively, Socrates' crime was indeed religious. He had offended the theological sensibilities of the period, but on top of that, his judges were heavily biased against him, as he had the reputation as the teacher of the greatest scoundrels in recent Athenian history. And here, we should remember that most of Socrates' judges were riffraff. They were members of the lumpen proletariat and hence staunch supporters of the democratic regime. Now, what about the second leg of the accusation concerning the daemonion? Let us see what Socrates has to tell us about that.
You have heard me often and in many places say that there is inside me something divine and supernatural, a daemonion, a voice which Anytus mentions and ridicules in his indictment. With me, this started when I was a boy, a voice which every time it appears always prevents me from doing what I'm about to do and never encourages me. This has always opposed my involvement in politics, and very rightly so. Because, know it well, Athenian men, if I had attempted to get involved in political affairs, I would have perished long ago and would not have benefited either you or myself. And while my usual oracular power of the daemonion would in the past appear very frequently and oppose me, even in trivial matters, whenever I was about to do something wrong, today the sign of the god has not appeared. It did not oppose me in the morning as I was leaving my house, nor when I was making my way towards the court, nor during the speech while I was preparing to say something. On the contrary, in other speeches before today, it had often appeared while I was talking. Now, however, in this case, it has not opposed any action or any word of mine. If I were about to do something that was not right, it would be impossible for my usual sign not to oppose me.
Even if the Athenians misunderstood this whole daemonion business and accepted, as per the indictment, that Socrates was indeed trying to introduce new gods into the city, it is unclear that this was a reason to execute him. In the turbulent final years of the 5th century, along with the rise in superstition and prejudice, there was a move away from traditional religious structures and towards new foreign cults. It was then, for example, that the medicine god, Asclepios, entered Athens, and a number of oriental divinities such as Cybele, her companion Varnavazos, Attis, Adonis. So one has to wonder what was specifically dangerous about Socrates' daemonion in particular. However, here there's a much, much more important and interesting observation to be made. We think of Socrates as the representative of unmitigated rationalism, the philosopher who submitted everything to logical control and left no room for emotion in his ethical considerations. And yet, he has just told us that he was guided by science and voices from God. Now, if we really wanted to salvage the super-rational Socrates, I suppose we could argue that these voices were triggers, were signals for Socrates that he had to reconsider what he was about to do. However, the passage we have just read clearly excludes the possibility that there were instances where Socrates ended up rejecting the divine prohibition after his own personal deliberation. Now, and this is a brain center conference, in the 21st century, there's a great temptation to medicalize and to psychologize these voices and to say that Socrates had an overinflated superego, or even that he suffered from schizophrenia, that these voices were psychotic episodes. Perhaps at the end of the day, a man with such a strong sense of duty, for whom doing the right thing was a non-negotiable divine command, had real difficulty explaining his experiences to people who did not share his own strong drives and inclinations towards justice. Now, after Socrates finished his speech, the court took a vote, and the verdict was guilty. Plato himself tells us that had a mere 30 votes gone the other way, the outcome would have been reversed. Therefore, assuming 500 judges, we have 224 Socrates, 280 against. There was no specified punishment for this offense in Athenian law, so his conviction had to be followed by another debate to set the punishment, the thymesis, the assessment, it was called. And the accuser Militor spoke first, and he requested the death penalty. We do not have the speech for the prosecution either, but Plato gives us Socrates' response, and it forms the second part of the apology. Now, you would have thought that considerations of common sense, game theory, as we say today, would have dictated to Socrates that he had to recommend a relatively strict punishment in order to give his judges a realistic alternative to the death penalty. For example, he could suggest exile or a hefty fine. But Socrates, who in the first part of the speech had appeared brave and defiant, but by and large respectful towards the court, now in this rebuttal he says that he does not consider himself deserving of any penalty or any punishment. He starts by saying that they should be giving him free meals at the Prytaneon, the town hall, exactly like they did with the winners of the Olympic Games. Olympic victors, he says, only make you appear good, I make you truly good. He then offers to pay a ridiculously low sum, 1 mna. Finally, after pressures from Plato and other rich friends of Socrates were present in the court, Socrates recommended a fine of 30 mna, which was more in line with the gravity of the case. The historian Xenophon, who has also written an account of the trial, calls Socrates' stance here deliberately suicidal. He says that Socrates was already 70 years old and he appreciated that life was only going to get worse from that point on, so he decided to appear arrogant and contemptuous, grandiloquent, Xenophon says, using big words, in order to force his judges to execute him while he was still in his prime. Now, it seems to me that Xenophon here is being incredibly obtuse, narrow-minded, and tone-deaf. This bean counter mentality is completely alien to the grandeur of Socrates. And after all, it is highly debatable whether with old age people become more prepared to abandon their lives, a point very beautifully illustrated in one of the best-known tragedies of the 5th century, the Alcestis of Euripides. Be that as it may, it is impossible not to be moved by the courage, the conviction, and the true dedication to the life of philosophy that Socrates demonstrates in this second part of the Apology.
Maybe someone could tell me, can't you change, Socrates, and get out of here and live in peace and quiet? This is exactly the most difficult point to explain to some of you. Because if I were to tell you that this would be disrespecting the God's command, and that for this reason I cannot go away quietly, you wouldn't believe me, and you would think that I am being ironic. And you would believe me even less if I were to tell you that the greatest good for man is this: to spend every day talking about virtue and about all other topics that you hear me discuss, and to examine myself and others. Ο δε ανεξέταστος βίος, ου βιωτός ανθρώπου. For the unexamined life is not worth living for man. But matters stand exactly as I tell you, men. Although it is not easy to convince you, and I have never considered myself deserving of any punishment or penalty.
Ο ανεξέταστος βίος ου βιωτός ανθρώπου. The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. Socrates' reputation as the model of the brave, virtuous, spiritual teacher rests to a very large extent on these words. They're justly quoted every time and everywhere that people have to fight for the right to think and express themselves freely, a glorious moment in the history of civilization. And unfortunately, the setting here is not some religious court of the Taliban, the Spanish Inquisition, or a show trial in a banana republic. Socrates here is addressing a people's court in classical Athens. So how are we, modern listeners, supposed to react when witnessing Athens, the birthplace of direct democracy and free speech, lead one of its most illustrious children to his death simply because, to put it bluntly, he refused to shut up? After Socrates' rebuttal was over, the court voted for a second time to determine the punishment. And it seems that the judges found his counter-proposal offensive, because not only did they ratify the death penalty, we read that 80 judges who had voted to acquit him before now voted for death. So a result of 140 versus 360. And while Socrates waits to be taken to prison, he finds the opportunity to make some further remarks to his judges, the third and final part of the apology. He tells them that he has no reason whatsoever to be afraid of death, simply because no one knows for sure what happens after death. Therefore, the fear of death is an example of this illusion, that one knows things that one really does not know. And Socrates has dedicated his whole life in the fight against this very illusion. Plato's apology of Socrates ends with these words.
But it is already time for us to go. I to die, you to live. Who is better off is unknown to everyone, except, perhaps, God.
The poet George Seferis, perhaps the greatest, or at least my favorite poet of the 20th century, the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1963, has incorporated these remarks into his poem I Κύχλοι, the thrush. So I would like us to read now, please, a part of Seferis' poem, both in Greek and in an English translation.
Κι άλλες φωνές, σιγά σιγά με τη σειρά τους ακολουθήσαν.
And in turn, more voices gradually followed.
Ψήθυροι φτενοί και διψασμένοι, που βγαίναν από του ήλιου τ' άλλο μέρος, το σκοτεινό.
Vulgar, thirsting whispers rising from the sun's dark other side.
Θα έλεγες γύρευαν να πιούν αίμα μια στάλα. Ήτανε γνώριμες, μα δεν μπορούσα να τις ξεχωρίσω.
As if looking for a drop of blood to drink, they felt familiar, but I could not tell them apart.
Και ήρθε η φωνή του γέρου. Αυτή την ένιωσα, πέφτοντας στην καρδιά της μέρας, ήσυχη σαν ακίνητη. Κι αν με δικάσετε να πιω φαρμάκι, ευχαριστώ. Το δίκιο σας θα είναι το δίκιο μου. Πού να πηγαίνω γυρίζοντας σε ξένους τόπους, ένα στρογγυλό λιθάρι. Το θάνατο τον προτιμώ. Ποιος πάγει το καλύτερο, ο Θεός το ξέρει.
Then came the old man's voice. This one I felt falling upon the day's heart, quiet as if unmoving. And if you rule that I should drink the poison, thank you. Your right will be mine. Why should I go wandering in foreign lands, a rolling stone? I prefer death. God only knows which one of us is headed to the better place.
Χώρες του ήλιου και δεν μπορείτε να αντικρίσετε τον ήλιο.
Lands of the sun, and you cannot face the sun.
Χώρες του ανθρώπου και δεν μπορείτε να αντικρίσετε τον άνθρωπο.
Lands of man, and you cannot face man.
There is a famous quote by Karl Marx that history repeats itself, first as tragedy and then as farce. Socrates' trial is extremely interesting because here tragedy and farce seem to coexist in parallel. The apology is tragic in the normal everyday meaning of the word. The paragon of spiritual virtue is executed for his beliefs and his way of life. But it is also tragic in a more technical, philosophical sense, because here we have a clash, a conflict between two radically different worldviews and eras. On the one hand, the traditional Hellenic way, where the individual is defined by his position inside social networks and structures, city, family, social class, and on the other hand, this new Socratic demand that we should all submit everything to a constant examination with the care of the soul as our first priority. As in a farce now, this trial seems to be the outcome of a chain of misunderstandings. Three fellows took Socrates to court, presumably to scare him off, to shake him up a little bit, taking advantage of the general confusion that prevailed in the city about the various intellectual movements, and borrowing most of their arguments from a comedy written some 25 years before by Aristophanes, the master jester of the century. And this farce led to death because, defying all expectations, Socrates refused to play the game. He refused to use the sympathy card, to plead for leniency, to bargain for his sentence. And we should note that this whole affair ends in a purely anti-tragic atmosphere, and that is the choice of its protagonist. Socrates goes to his death with a smile and insists that neither his judges nor his accusers can hurt him even after they have sentenced him to death. Nothing bad can happen to a good person, he tells us. The gods will never neglect his affairs. Socrates here, I think, signals the end of tragedy, because tragedy presupposes passion, suffering, irrevocable, incurable, fatal suffering. Tragedy presupposes gods who are hostile towards mortals, or at least indifferent, and it presupposes individuals who do not deny or ignore the distraction. They face it, often they invite it, with courage and dignity. Just imagine Oedipus' reaction had he been a disciple of Socrates. What? These two were my parents, really? Well, what do you know? Anyway, wrapping up. After his conviction, Socrates was taken to the city prison. His execution had to be delayed for a whole month because the Holy Ship of Athens had to return from a dance and music festival in the island of Delos. And that was 25 centuries before the island next to Delos, Mykonos, was to become the dance and music capital of Europe. There was no provision for an appeal to some higher court. If it were indeed true, as has been claimed, that the Athenians immediately regretted convicting Socrates, perhaps there would have been an opportunity for an emergency decree at the Ecclesia, the assembly of all citizens. However, in the Athens of 399 BCE, there was no appetite for more institutional anomaly. And after all, despite his subsequent status as a secular saint, Socrates was not particularly popular with his fellow Athenians, a point he himself admitted in his speech. Therefore, Socrates spent the last 30 days of his life in jail, and he managed to keep his good spirits even there. He passed his time discussing philosophy with his companions, and he started putting some of Aesop's fables to music. Again, as he says, in response to a divine command, which told him, make music and work. In the Phaedo, a dialogue that belongs to Plato's middle period and was therefore written quite a few years after the Apology. Phaedo, a young student of Socrates, was present at the execution, describes to a man called the Hecrates the teacher's final moments. So on his last day, Socrates engaged in a philosophical discussion, of course, his favorite activity. And the topic of the dialogue in the Phaedo is the soul, as befitted the occasion. Socrates then had a bath, prepared himself, and the time came for him to take the cup with the conium, the poison, the hemlock, from the hands of the executioner. So let us now read the final paragraphs from the Phaedo. The speaker here is Phaedo, Socrates' young student.
And Socrates took the cup with the poison, without trembling, and with absolutely no change in his demeanor or color, but giving the executioner his customary bull-like look, he asked him,
"What do you say? Is it proper to pour a libation from this drink or not?"
And the executioner replied, "We only grind exactly the requisite amount, Socrates."
I see. But it is appropriate and necessary to make a wish to the gods, to ensure that the relocation from here to there is fortunate. This is my wish, and may it be granted.
And as he said these words, he immediately drained the cup with great ease. Most of us had managed to hold back our tears before that. However, once we saw him drink, it was no longer possible. And against my will, my tears began to flow. So I covered my face and started crying, not for him, but for me, for I was about to lose such a man as my comrade. Crito, who had been unable to stop his tears even before me, stood up and moved to the side. Apollodoros, who hadn't stopped crying at all, let off a terrible cry of anguish and vexation, crushing everyone present except Socrates himself.
Oh, you marvelous people, what a way to act. This is exactly why I sent the woman away, to avoid behaviors of this sort. For I have heard that it is important to end one's life with good omens. So be patient and quiet.
And when we heard him, we felt shame and we stopped crying. Just as the executioner had advised him, Socrates then started walking around the room for a bit. But when he said that his legs had got heavy, he lay down. The executioner then started examining his feet and his legs. After a while, the executioner pinched Socrates' foot hard and asked him if he felt anything. He replied that he didn't. The executioner repeated the same with his shins, and going up with his hand, he showed us that Socrates had started getting cold and rigid. He kept examining him and said that when it reached the heart, Socrates would be gone. The executioner had almost reached the waist when Socrates, who had already covered his face with a sheet, suddenly uncovered himself and uttered what ended up being his final words.
Crito, we owe a cockerel to Asclepius. Offer it, and do not neglect it.
This will be done, Crito replied. See if you have any more instructions for us. But Socrates did not answer his question. After a short while, he stirred, and the executioner uncovered him. And Socrates' eyes were fixed. Seeing this, Crito went up to him and closed his eyes and his mouth. This, Hecrates, was the death of our comrade, who of all the men that we have known was the best and the wisest and the most just.
So much. You're a great and attentive audience. We really appreciate it. I think we have some time for Q&A now, so maybe you can make one microphone.
If you have questions, comments, you did it very well. Very, very touching. Very touching. Very
Thank you very much.
If anybody wants to ask anything,
A small question might be irrelevant, but thank you. I heard many times the word God pronounced and not the gods, and I was wondering if we were mentioning if the translation to English was to simplify the gods,
No.
or if it was talking about Apollo.
The ancient Greeks often referred to God, and maybe it was a way of speaking. Either they could be referring to Zeus or some higher power, but it was an expression current even before Plato. Just say God, God.
Singular.
And sometimes in the context, for example, in Homer, it's obvious which God is meant. Otherwise, it's meant some divine element that cannot be always defined. But there was no monotheism back then by any stretch. Yeah, it was just an expression. Yeah.
I was wondering, do we know of any philosophical text before the Greeks? Or did they invent philosophy?
I'm pretty sure that they invented Western philosophy. I am not sure what happened in the
China
Orient,
or-
and of course some of the Hebrew texts are before that, and they have elements that could be considered philosophical. But I mean, what is now known as the Western philosophical canon, I think,
It
starts
is
with the
really the
pre-Socratics.
Greeks.
The philosophers we know as the pre-Socratics were basically natural philosophers, that were scientists pondering the universe. Excuse me? Yeah, there must have been, yes. I mean, I'm pretty sure that there was. It's just, yeah. Confucius and Socrates were pretty much, I think, I think Confucius must have been 60 or 70 years older than Socrates. If you go to the Agora, it's interesting because the Chinese have financed a statue, which is in very bad taste, if you ask me, of Socrates and Confucius, the one next to each other. I don't know if we've given them a statue for Socrates to put in some place in China back. But yes, you're absolutely right, Confucius as well, but didn't make it into what is now known as the canon of the tradition. So you want to hear?
Did he have family, Socrates?
Yes, Socrates definitely had a wife, Xanthippe. He had 2 children. In the dialogue before the part we read, she meets him and he sends her away. That's why he says, that's why I sent the women away. Interesting, because her name is Xanthippe. Ipos means horse. So that's quite an aristocratic name. A point I did not mention. Socrates is the first person we know in Greek history for whom we cannot be certain of his class. I think he wasn't born poor, we can be quite certain about that. He was probably the equivalent of what we call middle class. If his father was a stonemason, that was the time when Pericles was rebuilding Athens, so that was quite profitable. Towards the end of his life, he didn't have any profession. So he probably lived off his rich friends, who, bought him meals and everything. And interestingly, there is another tradition saying that he had a second wife as well. So we don't know if that was a misunderstanding or whether in the end of the Peloponnesian War, the demographic situation had got so bad in Athens that they started allowing, men to marry multiple wives in order to solve this. But we can't be sure about that.
And children?
He had 2 children, yeah. One was called Sophroniskos after his father, and the second time.
So what is, according to Plato, Socrates' legacy? Is there any content?
Well, I think one of the most interesting questions in this whole story is where Socrates ends and when Plato starts. I mean, throughout his career, except for the very last word, which is the laws, most of what Plato wrote has a speaker called Socrates. But like I said in my speech, I find it incredible that Socrates would have said some of the things that Plato said in the later works. I mean, for one thing, they're extremely complex arguments. You need a written culture, and Socrates was, of course, was only speaking. I think Plato had a deep respect for the teacher. He loved him. He changed his life. Plato apparently was an aristocratic youth. Plato actually, it still means the same modern Greek, means wide. Plato's real name was Aristocles, and because he had a wrestler and had huge shoulders, they called him the wide one, Plato. But Socrates believed him, convinced him to give up everything else and to do philosophy instead. So I think with Plato it was a love relationship, but in many ways I think Socrates' example told him what to avoid in life. For example, famously, every time Plato got in trouble with the law, he just made a run for it. He didn't stay to be tried, both in Syracuse and in Athens. So it is a very, I don't mean to evade your question, but it's a very tricky point where the historical Socrates ends and where Plato's Socrates starts.
I'm sure you heard about the Hellenic Museum in Chicago.
No, I haven't actually, yeah.
There's one in Chicago.
Okay.
And every year they do the trial.
Okay.
But in an interesting way. They have their own judges
Okay.
and their own questionnaire.
Does he get acquitted ever? Do the audience take a vote, or is the result always to kill him?
They do that every year. I mean,
Yeah. Okay.
I can give you the address.
Okay, yeah, that's quite interesting, yeah. It's very interesting, I hadn't heard of that. Yes, please.
Yeah, just so obviously with the death of Socrates, when after was it sort of then vogue or again back in fashion to start reintroducing free speech and the constant questioning and examination?
Yeah.
So when sort of after, how much later did Athens readopt?
We can't be sure because a lot of the history was written by historians of philosophy writing around the Roman times, and by then Socrates had become a legend. So there's an attempt to change the history. For example, there's a story that immediately the Athenians regretted killing Socrates, but and that they exiled the prosecutors, which I have no reason to believe is true. Plato started his school a few years after Socrates' death, and then after Plato, Aristotle started his school. But the point I was making before with Socrates' example, these schools were much more closed affairs. These were recognizably like universities. You only had a select elite. It wasn't open to everyone. So I think to go back to street philosophers, there's a philosopher you might have heard, Diogenes. He was a street philosopher. And actually, Plato has called him Socrates gone mad. So maybe they both considered that they had inherited Socrates' legacy in their own way, so they didn't particularly like each other. So I think immediately, there were people like that, but not Plato and Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle were recognizably what we'd call university professors. They started their own private academies and taught philosophy to a more closed group. The lady behind you wants to ask a question. No, you wanted to ask a question? Do you have the microphone?
Yeah, as we know, the Greek Empire tried to impose the religion, contrary to the Romans who left their occupied people with their own religion. They didn't care very much. The Greeks were very tough on what was called Hellenization and forcing to convert. Do we know anything from the writings of Plato if the philosophers supported this attitude?
Well, it's interesting because the first time that the Greeks expanded aggressively was Alexander. And Alexander was very careful to respect the local customs as he found it. And there's a story that this is why he became unpopular with his own people, because rather than going and trying to impose the religion and the culture and the customs, he moved towards a synthesis. And they say that Alexander was the student of Aristotle, who was, of course, the student of Plato, who was the student of Socrates. In Socrates' time, I don't think it had ever crossed the minds that we ever go to conquer barbarian barbarians, as they called them. And the word barbarian, by the way, comes from bar, because the foreign languages sound like that. I don't think it had ever bothered Socrates what would they do if they were to conquer new lands. You know, the contact with barbarians was very limited, and they just killed them.
So there was no nationalism, really?
Well, it's interesting because we speak of the Greeks and the Greeks and the Greeks, but it was very much a city-state versus city-state. I mean, the Greeks became Greeks very few times in the calendar, in the Olympic Games, and they had a common religion. With the Persian Wars, they united to fight the Persians, but then once the Persians left, they started fighting again. So, yeah, I think it was Alexander who took this idea of Hellenism, and I think Alexander did it in order to convince all the Greeks to follow him in his campaigns, who said, look, we're all Greeks, let us go conquer other lands. That's where it first appears in this sense in history. Yes, sir.
Again, I have very naive
Yes.
knowledge about it, but Wikipedia story is that Socrates was a kind of much more orthodox on the Sparta side, again democracy. So what is your point of view? And actually that maybe this was a kind of punishment.
Yes, could you repeat the question? Sorry.
Again, reading from Wikipedia, okay? That Socrates was more on the side of the noble people from Sparta, and the idea that the noble people and the, let's say, the rich should control and less of democracy. So,
okay. This is a very interesting point. I mean, if you ask anybody what's the biggest legacy of Greece, of Athens, you will say Athenian democracy. None of the writers that have survived today were pro-democratic. They were all aristocratic, and in the one way or another, they were against democracy. Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, all these guys were aristocrats. They had a big disdain for the people. With Socrates, it is more interesting whether he was for democracy or not. There is another dialogue by Plato where his friend Crito, who is mentioned, comes and tells me, let's escape. We have bribed your gods, and we should escape. And Socrates says, no, I've spent all my life in Athens. I respect these laws. I like the laws, so I should stay here. So when Socrates says, I like the laws of Athens, people say, what laws could he be talking about? He must be talking about democracy, because that was the main, he couldn't be talking about trade laws or economic laws or tax system, right? So people suggest that for Socrates to say, he wasn't pro-democracy, but Socrates was criticizing everything. And that's the point I was trying to make about the caryatids. You can have someone say today, President Trump is a fool, and the painters today are fools, and the composers are fools. And I can believe it, because I'm not sure how many of us are going to survive in 2,000 years. But when Socrates says all my fellow Athenians are fools, he's talking about the people who built the Acropolis, and he's talking about Pericles, and he's talking about Sophocles. So it's a very interesting question how we, as modern readers, putting the two side by side, are supposed to react to this critique against the civilization and against this culture that we have such respect for. So I think, to answer your question, I think Socrates liked to say no to everyone, no to everyone. And it came to Plato to start to find some positive answers. Okay, we don't like this, what do we like? I think that was Plato's job more than Socrates.
I want to thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your attention. You're a great audience.
And both of you,
yes,
father and daughter, daughter and father, you were fantastic, really. Thank you very, very much, very, very much. You don't know in advance when we spoke by Zoom. You don't know what will happen. So it's a chance. It was a very successful chance. Thank you very much. Thank you. So.